have accounts of Druids halting entire armies that are facing each other down. The term Celts comes from the Greek keltoi, meaning barbarians. The Romans called them Galli, or Gauls. The Celts made their very dramatic and violent entrance onto the Greco-Roman stage around 387 BC. Probably known to the Greco-Roman world before this, but their main entrance came in 387 BC when the Celts sacked Rome and probably fundamentally changed Roman history. Well, a few decades later, the Celts could be found sacking Delphi over in Greece. And then they kept moving east toward Asia, eventually settling in Galatia. These are the Galatians, named after the Gauls. So the Celts came to be known as fierce warriors, skilled horsemen, charioteers. They often served as mercenaries for the Carthaginians during the Punic Wars. So the Romans fought the Celts again there, and in fact employed the Celts themselves eventually as mercenaries. And in this capacity, we are fortunate enough to have some observations by Romans, written observations of the Celts, which is good because the Celts didn't leave observations of themselves, really. So, for example, Julius Caesar, who himself was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands or millions of Gauls or Celts, described Celtic armies as being led by a charismatic chieftain who had proved himself through individual acts of heroism in battle. The loyalty that he thereby garnered from his warriors was cemented later via gift-giving, lavish gift-giving, and ritual feasting. So that's Julius Caesar's description of Celtic armies and their leaders. In fact, archaeology has somewhat corroborated that. We found the graves of these Celtic chieftains, and they are filled with weapons, and they are filled with stacks of drinking horns, so that in the next life, the chieftain can make war and feast. Well, the Celts speak an Indo-European language. The oldest group of people that we can call Celts, maybe, show up around 1400 BC on the Upper Danube. We call this culture the Urnfield culture because they cremated their dead, put the ashes in urns, and buried the urns. The Urnfield culture. These Celts will end up spreading all across Europe. There are going to be Celts as far east as Anatolia and Transylvania and the Black Sea, and as far west as Spain, Britain, and Ireland. Okay, so this is a transcontinental culture, at least on a superficial level. This Celtic culture, starting with perhaps the Urnfield culture. We'll fast forward to about 700 BC, and we know that at least a group of Celts traded with the Greeks. And we know that because archaeologists found at a site called Hallstatt, one of the great early sites of the so-called Hallstatt culture. They found in the graves of Celtic chieftains not just bronze items, the Celts worked bronze, but also Greek pottery and knowledge of ironworking in addition. Okay, and so then from this point on, from about 700 on over the next few centuries, the Hallstatt culture spreads west and begins to displace or destroy or assimilate previous Celtic peoples in Central and Western Europe. Well, by the 400s, Hallstatt culture is in decline, but it's being replaced or subsumed in the next iteration of Celtic culture, that is Latin culture. And like previous Celts, Latin culture, Celts, spread east and west all the way across the continent too, but there's more of an orientation this time south onto the Italian peninsula. And we're going to see Celts of this culture as raiding parties active all over Italy, even in Sicily. And we're going to see them settle in large groups on both sides of the Alps. And that's going to be important. These are also the Celts that end up sacking Rome, sacking Delphi, and settling in Anatolia. By the 300s, groups of these Celts are in the Balkans. Alexander the Great is receiving their delegations. So these guys too spread out far and wide. But even though they're spread out far and wide, we can still call these people a people. We can still identify them as Celtic. This is one people, distinct from the other peoples around them by a shared language, shared clothing styles, shared artistic styles, shared social organization, and shared traditions and customs. Now, the Celts were organized into clans and tribes, each tribe led by a chieftain. Sometimes the chieftain is referred to as a king. That might be too glorious a title. There were female chieftains or queens as well, although less commonly. But we know that the Celts were from time to time ruled by women. Within the tribe, you could divide Celtic society into at least 4 strata. You've got the ruler, the ruler's family at the top, and then a military aristocracy, the warriors, the warrior class, and then the free men, and then underneath the free men there was a slave class. Now, the vast majority of the free men are agriculturalists. Some of the Celts did raise cattle, but overwhelmingly the Celtic freeman is a farmer. Small plots of land, but a farmer. The chieftain and his warriors might live organized around a hill fort, and from among those warriors, from among the ranks of the warriors, would be recruited the Druids. So the Druids, these are Celtic priests or shamans who went through pretty intense training to become Druids. According to Julius Caesar, the Druids are the most educated of the Gauls and had to undergo 20 years of education. Mostly, it seems, memorizing sacred verses. Unfortunately, we don't have those sacred verses anymore to study. But apparently, by the time the Druids were done, they were qualified to make prophecies and to carry out various religious rituals, including sacrifice, including human sacrifice, and acted as judges and had great persuasive power. We have accounts of Druids halting entire armies that are facing each other down. The Druids are able to persuade them not to attack each other. So significant persuasive power. And we know that some women became Druids as well, just like there were women among the warriors. But it's not just agriculturalists, warriors, and cattle raisers and Druids. Among the freemen, there were merchants. Think of the trade with the Greeks or the Etruscans. There were artisans. Take a look at the highly sophisticated and beautiful Latin culture artistic production. It's pretty amazing stuff. There were bards. The Celts seem to have put a premium on oral literary composition and music. We know there were Celtic potters because I'm here at a Celtic site in southern Poland, just outside of Krakow, where archaeologists have discovered pottery creation among the Celts that lived here. Another thing that they discovered among the Celts that lived here, a mint. And the Celts here minted silver coins. And then, of course, there were slaves. The slave class seems to have been, these are war captives that once you become a slave, in Celtic society, you're pretty much always going to remain a slave. The releasing of slaves, the freeing of slaves seems to have been very rare and, in fact, discouraged. The Celts famously sacked Rome around 387 BC. In fact, it was so bad that it inspired the Romans to build this wall. This is one of the last remnants of the Servian wall left here in Rome. So that's how much the Celts rocked the Romans. In fact, it made such an impression that perhaps the Celtic sack of Rome around 387 kick-started the building of the Roman Empire. The Romans reacted by, over the next several generations, conquering the entire Italian peninsula. And by 225, the Celts, or Celtic influence in Italy, had largely diminished as a result of the loss at the Battle of Telamon. A Celtic coalition had lost the hands of the Romans at the Battle of Telamon. And by the 100s, the Romans are pushing north over the Alps into Celtic lands in Transalpine Gaul. At the same time that the Celts are fighting the Romans, they're also facing another enemy from the east. That is, various Germanic peoples. The Germanic peoples have already begun to displace the Celts in Central Europe. And by the 100s BC, you have at least a couple Germanic peoples, identified as the Cimbri and Teutoni, entering Gaul and ravaging the country. In fact, there were probably huge migrations, refugee displacements of Celts streaming across the Rhine, west across the Rhine, to escape the Cimbri and the Teutoni. And the chaos may have been enough, and the displacement, to pave the way for Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the Gallic Wars later on. Julius Caesar conquered Gaul between 58 and 52 BC. In 54 BC, he even crossed the Channel and invaded Britain. But it wasn't easy. Conquering Gaul was not easy. Caesar described the Gauls, these Celts, as ferocious warriors, particularly good at throwing the javelin, good horsemen, good charioteers. He described them as having long hair, long shields. These are essentially wooden panels covered in animal skins, long swords, very good fighters. In fact, in 52 BC, towards the end of his campaign, the Celts defeated Caesar at Gergovia. But then later that year, again 52 BC, defeated by Caesar at Alesia, and thereafter Gaul would be a Roman province. Now, about 100 years after Caesar first invaded Britain, the Romans invaded Britain again, this time for real, under the Emperor Claudius, and pushed the Britons, these Celts, back, pushed them north to Scotland or west to Wales and Cornwall. Ireland would be the last great bastion of Celtic culture in Europe. The Celts have been pushed all the way west, largely to Ireland. Now, part of the reason Celtic culture survived so well in Ireland is because the Romans never conquered it. And when the Angles and the Saxons and other Germanic peoples came over to the British Isles, they largely left Ireland alone. Of course, Vikings will penetrate Ireland. Vikings will settle there. Dublin was a Viking settlement. There were slaughters and things, but Celtic culture survived. Now, in 1160, the Normans conquered Ireland, and the British are going to stick around till 1922, not counting Northern Ireland. 1922. But through it all, Celtic culture, at least partially, survived. And today, Celtic culture is observable. 2,500 years later, still observable. In particular, in terms of language. Celtic languages still spoken today in Ireland, in Highland Scotland, in Wales, on the Isle of Man, and in Brittany.